Thomas Hobbes was born in 1588 and died in 1679. He was an English philosopher, best known today for his work on political philosophy, although he's also had an influence in a wide range of fields, including what's called philosophy of mind, logic, philosophy of language, metaphysics, mathematics, and even physics. He's probably best known for his 1651 book, Leviathan. All of his main works of philosophy were actually written when he was in his early 50s and later, so he was not one of these prodigies who was writing his best work in his teens and 20s. Little's known about his mother, but his father was a somewhat disreputable local clergyman. Hobbes came from relatively modest means and spent most of his life working as a tutor and in other capacities for members of the wealthy Cavendish family. This gave him time to think, write, and have access to books and other leading scientists and intellectuals, including Galileo, Descartes, and Francis Bacon. In part due to civil wars going on in England at the time, he spent the years from 1640 to 1651 living in exile in Paris, and this political turmoil in the background was important to the views he developed in Leviathan, as we'll see. His social contract theory of the state has served as the foundation for much of Western political philosophy, and he's credited by some as being the founder of modern political philosophy and even political science. He was a materialist, embracing the view that human beings were composed of physical matter and that we obey the same physical laws as other matter, or at least the matter that composes us obeys those laws. And he saw much of his work as a scientific study of human beings and their interactions. So in some ways, he saw himself as a kind of scientist. He developed some of the fundamental tenets of European liberal political thought, including the idea that the state is artificial rather than natural. It's not just something that exists independent of what we do. It's a creation of humans. The idea that individuals have rights, and that these are in some sense inalienable or intrinsic to them. He developed the idea that all men are in some sense equal, so this idea of the natural equality of men. And he developed the idea of the importance of the consent of the people as a basis for the foundation of the state. For our purposes, we're interested in the answer he gave to the question, why should we have a state? To answer that question, he asks us to imagine what things would be like without any government at all, what things would be like if we lived in what he calls a state of nature. So here, Hobbes engages in what philosophers call a thought experiment. He doesn't have direct evidence of what things would be like if there were no government or political institutions, but he asks us to imagine what it would be like, given what we know about what human beings are like. Some might imagine a state of nature to be a kind of paradise, but that was not Hobbes's view. He was worried in particular about the state of continual fear that we would be in such a state. We couldn't trust other people not to do violence against us, not to steal our possessions or harm our families. And there would be no entity in place to help us arbitrate and peacefully resolve our disputes. So as a result, we wouldn't be able to work together, and our living together would be marked by constant fear and frequent violence. Hobbes argues that such a dissolute condition of masterless men, without subjection to laws and a coercive power to tie their hands from raping and revenge, would make impossible the security upon which comfortable, civilized life depends. As he puts it, there would be no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, and, which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. Famously, Hobbes said this would lead to the life of man being solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So one question we might ask, is Hobbes too pessimistic about what things would be like? Well, he tried to start with plausible views about what human beings are like. He doesn't want to start with the assumption that we're all terrible monsters, for example. So here's what he says. In the nature of man, we find three principal causes of quarrel. First, competition. Secondly, diffidence. Thirdly, glory. The first maketh men invade for gain, the second for safety, and the third for reputation. The first use violence to make themselves masters of other men's persons, wives, children, and cattle. The second, to defend them. The third, for trifles, as a word, a smile, a different opinion, and any other sign or undervalue, either direct in their persons or by reflection in their kindred, their friends, their nation, their profession, or their name. So these are supposed to be the kinds of things that are true of us that make us so that we would live in a state of war if we were living in a state of nature. He notes, too, that each of us is roughly equal in the faculties of body and mind. This idea isn't that we're all exactly the same, but that somehow no one of us is so much stronger or so much smarter than any other one of us that that person could come to dominate everybody else. There'd be a constant fear that even the strongest and smartest would worry that they wouldn't be safe. So these facts taken together motivate something like the following argument, which we find in chapter 13 of the Leviathan. And here I'll break it out into premises that will lead to a conclusion. So premise 1, by nature, each of us is roughly equal in the faculties of body and mind. None of us can consistently dominate the others through force or wit. Premise 2, in each of our natures there are several desires. A, desires for things, B, desires for safety, and C, desires for social standing. Premise 3, if there are conditions of natural equality and human beings possess the above desires, and there is no external checking force, then there will be a state of war where, and this is a quote, where every man is enemy to every man. Premise 4, a state of nature is a condition in which there is no external checking force, such as a common power. That's sort of the definition of a state of nature. So, from these premises, we get this conclusion. If there is a state of nature, there will be a state of war where every man is enemy to every man. So, what I've just done is reconstruct Hobbes' argument as taken from the text. This isn't exactly how he sets it out, but this is one of the main things that philosophers do. Attempt to take a passage of text, or even something someone has said in conversation, and break the argument down into its parts, premises leading to a conclusion. In some cases you'll have sub-conclusions, which then serve as premises for a yet further conclusion. Philosophers spend a lot of time thinking about how to reconstruct arguments and about whether those arguments have certain properties, whether they're valid or whether they're sound. A valid argument is one in which, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. The truth of the premises guarantees or logically entails the truth of the conclusion. But we don't say anything yet when we talk about validity as to whether the premises are actually true or not. We're just supposing if they were true, then the conclusion would follow. A sound argument is one that is valid and which has premises which are in fact true. So, if you're interested in these ideas of validity and soundness, or in general, how to think about valid arguments, I recommend the Coursera course, Think Again, How to Reason and Argue. That course focuses on different forms of valid arguments and on how to move from passages of text to offer reconstructions of arguments. In this class, I will often try to pull out the argument from the text that I'll have had you read, and in many cases you could do this as well at home. And I encourage you to try doing it and to match up what you do with what I've done. In most cases, there are many different ways of taking a passage of text and turning it into an argument. Some of these will be better or worse arguments, and one skill that philosophers try to develop is reading an argument as charitably as possible, so creating the strongest possible argument to then engage with, rather than picking an argument or trying to develop an argument that really is as uncharitable as possible, or sort of interprets it as weak as possible and as easy to refute as possible. That's not worth doing in most cases. We want to look at the best and strongest version of arguments. So, returning to the argument at hand, we might ask several questions about the various premises that we've set out, including whether Hobbes has an unduly pessimistic view of human nature, which would go to whether premises 2 and 3 are true, and whether the state, as an external force, is really necessary to move us out of the state of nature. So in the next segment, we will turn to consider those questions and other questions about the state of nature argument.